Picture a lake 700 feet below sea level, boxed in on every side by hills and cliffs. Visualize a small, open wooden boat, a Galilean fishing boat, built for this exact lake, carrying Jesus and his disciples. The sky is very clear, and the weather is fine, but all of a sudden, not hours, just minutes, it turned from calm to violent. And imagine, in the middle of it all, a man is asleep. That is the scene we're looking into. 4 verses in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. Only 4 verses, and yet this short passage is one of the most carefully built arguments in the entire New Testament, an argument about who, exactly, Jesus is. In this passage, we will look up on some Greek text word by word, because the words Matthew chooses are doing more work than any translation fully shows. Let us begin. Here's what happens. Jesus gets into a boat. His disciples follow. It's the conclusion of an exhausting day. A leper cleansed. A centurion's servant healed from a distance. Peter's mother-in-law raised from a fever. A crowd of the sick and demon-possessed brought to him at sundown. 2 people have just approached him about the cost of following him, and Jesus has given them both hard, unsentimental answers. And then, he says, let's go to the other side, into the boat, out onto the water. They leave, probably in the evening, heading east across the lake toward the region of the Gadarenes. And then, suddenly, a storm hits. Not just an ordinary storm. It was a violent storm. Matthew's word choice, which we will also study, describes something closer to a violent convulsion of the sea. Waves are breaking over the sides of the boat. It's taking on water. And in the middle of this, Jesus is asleep. Not just taking a nap. Jesus seems having a deep sleep that even his own disciples, several of them professional fishermen who had spent their working lives on this exact water, have to go wake him up. They were terrified and say, "Lord, save us. We are perishing." Jesus awaken. His first words aren't to the storm, but to his disciples. "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" Then, and only then, he stands, and he rebukes the wind and the sea, and it goes still, not gradually, rather completely, immediately still. So the men marveled, saying, "Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" That question is the door this entire passage is built to walk you through. Let's begin our study with the lake, because the geography isn't just scenery, it's part of the argument. The Sea of Galilee, also called Lake Kinneret, or the Lake of Gennesaret, isn't technically a sea at all. It's a freshwater lake, roughly 13 miles long. But its most important feature is elevation. The surface sits close to 700 feet below sea level, one of the lowest freshwater lakes on Earth, sitting inside a bowl. To the east, hills rise as much as 2,000 feet above the shoreline. To the west, near Magdala, a cliff called Mount Arbel juts up nearly 600 feet, practically overhanging the water. Here's why that matters. The air over the lake is warm and humid almost year-round, trapped down in that low basin. But air spilling down off the surrounding heights, cold air funneling through narrow ravines on both the eastern and western sides, is cool and heavy. When that cold air slams into the warm air sitting over the water, you get exactly the instability that produces sudden, violent local storms. Meteorologists who've studied the lake describe wind-gathering force as it's funneled through the terrain, then dropping onto the surface almost without warning, turning glass-smooth water into what one researcher called a seething, roaring cauldron within minutes. There's a second factor, depth, or the lack of it. At its deepest, the lake is only around 140 to 200 feet, and much of it is considerably shallower. A shallow body of water gets whipped into wave action far faster than deep water because there's less volume to absorb the wind's energy. Put those together, a bowl-shaped basin funneling cold air onto warm air sitting over a shallow lake, and you get a body of water that can go from calm to life-threatening in the time it takes to notice the sky has changed. This wasn't superstition or exaggeration on the disciples' part. It's simple regional meteorology, and it's still true today. Researchers who've mapped wind behavior around the Sea of Galilee distinguish between storms coming from different directions, each with its own character. Winds funneling down from the east, off the Golan Escarpment, tend to be the most sudden and violent, dropping almost vertically onto the water through steep wadis, the dry, narrow ravines that cut through the hillsides. Storms rolling in from the west, squeezed through narrow winding wadis on that side of the lake, are described in similarly dramatic terms, gusts gathering force as they are forced through the terrain, then descending onto the lake's surface with mounting power, sometimes colliding with wind coming off the opposite shore to compound the effect. The scripture did not mention the number of disciples in the boat, but we know that there were career fishermen at this exact lake. Men who had spent their working lives reading this water, who knew its moods, who could probably smell a change in the weather before it arrived. And even they were terrified enough to wake a sleeping Jesus and tell him they were about to die. They are seasoned fishermen, recognizing a genuine, sudden, mortal danger, precisely because fishermen who worked this lake for a living would have known the warning signs, the particular look of the sky, the shift in air pressure. That's exactly why their fear registers as significant. This is a real lake, with a documented, physically explainable pattern of sudden storms, described by people, then and now, in strikingly similar terms. Now let's open the Greek text itself, because this is where the passage gets genuinely startling, and most English translations quietly smooth it over. The word Matthew uses in verse 24, which your Bible probably renders storm, tempest, or furious storm, is the Greek word seismos. You already know this word. It's the direct root of seismic and seismograph. Here's what makes this word choice remarkable. Seismos appears 14 times across the New Testament, and in every single other occurrence it's translated earthquake. It's the word used for the earthquake at the moment Jesus dies on the cross in Matthew chapter 27. It's the word for the earthquake that rolls the stone away from the tomb in Matthew chapter 28. It's the word Jesus himself uses in Matthew chapter 24 when he warns of earthquakes in various places as a sign of the end of the age. Only here, on the Sea of Galilee, does virtually every English translation switch the word to storm instead of earthquake, almost certainly to harmonize Matthew's account with Mark and Luke, both of which use a different Greek word, lailaps, meaning a violent windstorm, for the same event. The root of seismos is the verb seio, to shake or to quake, a word whose basic sense in Greek writing going back centuries before Matthew, in historians like Herodotus and playwrights like Sophocles, was simply a shaking, a commotion, which could describe either the trembling of solid ground or, more rarely, an agitation of the sea or air. Matthew reaches for that rarer, more violent sense rather than the ordinary word for a windstorm, and he intensifies it further. He doesn't just write seismos, he writes seismos megas, a great shaking, a megaquake, in the sea itself. Whatever the reason behind the choice, the effect for a Greek reading audience would have been striking. This is not described as merely rough weather. It's described in language that everywhere else means the earth itself convulsing, and into that convulsion, one man is asleep, and then, standing up, silences it with his voice. The second word sits in verse 26. He rebuked the winds and the sea. The Greek verb behind rebuked is epitomao. Break the word into its parts. It's built from epi, upon or against, fused to tamao, related to time, honor, or value. Put together, epitimao originally carried a sense of formally charging someone with a fault, the way a judge levies a charge, not the way a friend expresses a passing complaint. By the New Testament, the word has narrowed into something closer to charge sharply, admonish with authority, command with force, and here's the detail that matters most. This is the exact same verb Matthew uses elsewhere for Jesus confronting demonic spirits. When Jesus rebukes an unclean spirit and it leaves a person, that's epitoma. When Peter later takes Jesus aside to rebuke him for predicting his own death, that's epitomao too, a forceful, authoritative confrontation, not a gentle suggestion. So when Matthew writes that Jesus rebuked the wind and the sea, he's reaching for the same verb used for confronting hostile spiritual forces, language that treats the wind and waves less like neutral weather to be calmed, and more like something to be directly confronted and subdued by an act of will and authority. Jesus doesn't pray over the storm. He doesn't ask for calm. He speaks to it the way you would speak to something that needs to be brought under control, not a request, but with a strong command. Matthew describes the word by confrontations with unclean spirits, and the outcome is immediate and total. No ritual, no intermediary, no elaborate process, just authority exercised directly. The word itself, epitimao, is a term of authority, force, and command consistently used elsewhere for Jesus confronting things that oppose him. Whatever else is going on physically, Linguistically, Jesus is not asking, he's commanding. This is why the word matters. No human being in the Hebrew Bible ever rebukes the sea directly. God alone does. Jesus' use of epitomao is the specific word that makes Matthew proves that Jesus has divine authority. The value of the action shows no ritual, no intermediary, no elaborate process, just authority exercised directly. Verse 26 gives us a third word worth real attention, oligopistos. Matthew uses it 4 times in his Gospel, more than anywhere else in the New Testament combined, with just one other appearance in Luke. It's practically Matthew's signature word. This is a compound word, oligos, small, few, or little, and pistis means faith, trust, or belief, which is one of the most important words in the entire New Testament. Combine them together and will form oligopistos, literally means something like little faith one, or more naturally, person of small trust. When Peter, walking on the water toward Jesus, notices the wind and begins to sink, and when the disciples worry about having forgotten to bring bread, in those events, it's not about no faith. Jesus uses this word for outright unbelief. Oligopistos assumes faith is present. It's just undersized for the crisis at hand. Notice the sequence Matthew gives us. Jesus asks the question, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" before he calms the storm, not after. He confronts their fear while the waves are still crashing over the sides, while the outcome is still, as far as they know, entirely uncertain. The correction comes first, the demonstration follows. Matthew returns to this exact word across the rest of his gospel, and it forms something like a running diagnosis of the disciples' spiritual condition throughout the whole narrative. A few chapters later, walking toward Jesus on the water at night, Peter takes his eyes off him, notices the wind, and begins to sink, and Jesus catches him with the identical word. Little faith one. Why did you doubt? Matthew uses to describe a very specific spiritual condition, not unbelief exactly, but a shaky, forgetful faith that panics under pressure, despite having already seen enough evidence to trust. The question this passage leaves each of us with is not really about ancient weather patterns on a lake in the Galilee. It's the same question the disciples were left with, soaking wet, in stunned silence, staring at a suddenly glassy sea. What do you do with a faith that is technically present, but too small for the storm you're actually in? If this kind of word-by-word, evidence-based Bible study is useful to you, consider subscribing. We do a deep dive, working straight through the Gospels, one passage at a time. Drop a comment and let me know what's the storm you're in right now so we can pray for you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.